4 months into the Trump administration, and threats to the rule of law have been the theme of this regime so far. It is the question on everybody's mind: how will the rule of law survive Donald Trump's autocracy? But what if the rule of law is not actually law? What if the rule of law, as decided by the United States Supreme Court and its 6-3 Republican supermajority, put there by Leonard Leo and a right-wing dark money apparatus that's been active over decades to build a court to drive its interests, is corrupt? What if it is driven not by any attachment to law or the text of the Constitution, but by vibes and grievance? These are the questions posed in an extraordinary new book from Professor Leah Litman at the University of Michigan, the co-host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast. The book is Lawless: How the Supreme Court Runs on Conservative Grievance, Fringe Theories, and Bad Vibes. Welcome back to LegalAF with Court Accountability. I'm thrilled to be here with Michael Popok and Professor Litman herself. Leah, we are so thrilled to have you here. How are Americans supposed to process what the rule of law means if indeed, as you so eloquently and clearly communicate in this book, so much of what we know as law is being driven by fringe theories and grievance and vibes?
Yeah, so I guess what I would say is two things. One is, I think at bottom, the rule of law is up to us. We shouldn't cede it to the Republican justices on the Supreme Court. I worry in particular, there's a birthright citizenship argument, that case the Supreme Court is going to hear. And a part of me is just really concerned that everyone is being lulled into complacency, thinking, oh, well, the Supreme Court is obviously going to say this executive order can't stand, Trump administration can't enforce it anywhere. And when they say it, right, like, our daddy, Chief Justice John Roberts, will have made everything okay. And so the Supreme Court will be all good and well. And no, right? That is not how this works. And just because they say something doesn't make it true. And we shouldn't just hand over the protection of the rule of law to them, in part because they are so bad at it. In their view, the rule of law kind of means rule by Republicans. They view political power as legitimate when it is exercised by Republican presidents and the Republican Party. And they look for every way to interfere with Democratic presidents' ability to govern. And they basically cast, the Democratic Party's views/ideology as mostly unconstitutional. So I think part of this book is designed to invigorate people and get them engaged enough to take the law into their own hands and take their case to the public, rather than focusing just on the courts and assuming the courts are going to do the job for us.
If Chief Justice Roberts is our daddy, I want to put myself up for adoption. It's a great phrase you use.
Very dysfunctional family.
Let me ask a question. I know it's going to come up from our audience who really just consumes this type of analysis and information at the intersection of law, politics, and the Supreme Court. And it really has to do with truthfully, you'll tell us. In writing the book in this era of Trump, are you concerned at all about MAGA attacks on you? And I want to compliment your courage. It's easy to write a book like this during the Obama administration or the Biden administration. It's a lot harder, is it not, during this era of retribution and vindictiveness, as exhibited by not only Donald Trump but all of his sycophants in the Department of Justice around him?
Yeah, I mean, I know I will get some pushback and hate and flack, but the reality is, I have already kind of exposed myself to some of that just with public commentary and the podcast. The founder of this Article 3 project, which I know you all are familiar with, Mike Davis, who decided the Federalist Society was not quite unhinged enough, he put me on the list of possible judicial nominees in the Biden administration. And then that image and chart got shown on Fox News. And let me tell you, some people were very unhappy with that, and me. So yes, I have received a fair amount of haterade. I temporarily took my email and phone number down off of the internet for a while after that happened. So, it's going to happen. It's going to happen. But I just feel like this is just another iteration of we cannot self-censor. We cannot obey in advance. I am in a very privileged position. I'm a law professor. There is campus security. If I ever feel in danger, I can ask them, for advice or protection. I certainly hope my home address never gets out on the internet. But, we got to do what we got to do. And I am in, again, like a very
Yeah.
good position, all things considered.
Yeah,
to
and
do
we
it.
appreciate you doing it, and of course we're big followers and fans of the podcast as well. Alex, you want to walk the professor and our audience through some of the findings that animate her analysis? Her
Yeah,
research?
Leah, I'd love to dig into this idea of grievance and vibes. It's so important, right? And it ties to something you said about the importance of people being able to access their own constitution. This was a lay document. It is a lay document. I think it's one of the reasons why we've got such an engaged audience here at LegalAF, why you have found such a devoted, loyal audience at Strict Scrutiny, because you're just sort of breaking down the bullshit. You're pulling back the veneer of all this doctrinal trappings, these legal theories that often are used as pretext to justify, to normalize, to legitimize what really is a grievance and vibes-based legal movement that the court's majority is driving. And you can see it back in its history from the early formation of the Federalist Society on law school campuses in the early 80s, when conservative students felt aggrieved by the fact that they were in the minority and that their toxic views were not landing them as many dates probably as they would have liked. So how has that manifested into such a legal juggernaut at the U.S. Supreme Court?
Yeah, well, so they decided they weren't getting invitations to parties, so they would have their own parties that were funded by billionaires and dark money. No, that's an oversimplification. But yeah, so the concept of vibes is just this notion that they are letting their feelings and the general gist and worldview of their party drive the law. And so that's what I kind of intend to be conveying, with that phrase. I do think that the big vibe, or at least a big vibe that is driving so many different areas of law, is this idea of conservative grievance, this feeling that they are really put upon and victimized by an increasingly pluralistic, diverse, secular society that isn't so into their weird, unhinged views. And so you can see this in so many different areas of law. It's the idea that the wealthy donor is just so put out by being regulated, or so put upon and discriminated against when they can't flood an election with several hundred millions of dollars. It's the idea that the conservative and religious parent is like so brutally attacked when their child is read a storybook that has LGBTQ characters in schools. They somehow manage to make this all about them. And by this, I mean like civil rights and equality for groups that haven't always been included in American society. Like, these guys have the worst main character energy. It's just insane. And they have put this into, again, like all of these different areas of law. And it
But
is
Leah,
really
if I
wild
can just
to see.
interject, what has the world actually come to if a Supreme Court justice can't fly an insurrectionary flag outside of his own home?
Why do we hate flags so much? Why do we hate home decor? Obviously, that is their right.
We're not being fair. His wife likes flags. And
Right.
and if I was an advocate about to present a case related to Jan 6th in any way, and I just happened to ride by the Alito's house on the day of the oral argument, and I saw flying from his house a flag of insurrection and an upside down flag, I shouldn't take anything from that. If I was an advocate,
you should feel great. You should feel great about the rule of law and your chances before this very independent, neutral court, obviously.
Absolutely. What you said something that has the benefit of being totally true, and something that I had never really articulated to other people, which is all this put upon white discrimination, the entirety of my natural born life has been a Republican dominated Supreme. I've never had the Supreme Court at a moderate or liberal majority ever. I mean, I'm too young to remember the Warren Court, Burger Court would have been So every court since for 50 years plus is Republican majority. So what's the problem for the Republicans?
Well, so two things. One is that is just a perfect encapsulation and symptom of the conservative grievance industrial complex that this party and movement run on, right? Because nothing will ever be good enough for them. The fact that there have been a majority of Republican appointed Supreme Court justices now for over 5 decades, right? Like that's not good enough. And during that time, they were screaming, their faces off about how the court was too left, too liberal, too progressive. It was out to get conservatives. And they used that again to whip people into a frenzy and to cater to these fears of replacement and anxiety about an increasingly diverse country, and use that as a political strategy. And so, unsurprisingly, that same energy is now appearing in the law. And they continue to beat this drum even now, which is just wild. I mean, consider the meltdown that happened when Justice Barrett had the audacity to say the president cannot exercise the legislative power. They were like, oh my gosh, obviously the president should adhere to judicial decisions or court orders, because again, nothing is ever going to be good enough for them except complete and utter domination. That's what they want.
How are you, Leo, how are you reading, just to bring your book into like real time, literally real time? We had an extraordinary series of events starting on Law Day on May 1 with Ketanji Brown Jackson, standing ovation in Puerto Rico, Sotomayor, and Roberts twice in the last 48 hours while the court's still in session. They haven't even gotten to their last argument. They're not on summer break yet. And in those hushed tones that only Supreme Court justices can use, maybe not Sotomayor as much, they're talking about defending the rule of law. They're talking about defending a judiciary under attack. They're talking about defending law firms and lawyers under attack as a profession. What are you making of them breaking their silence, so to speak, at this critical moment in the Trump era, the first 110 days? Or do you make anything of it?
I kind of feel like talk is cheap, waiting to see the action, because, after Chief Justice Roberts made his first statement and intervention about how impeachment isn't the remedy for rulings you don't like, appellate review is the process. That was said about Trump's complaints about Judge Boasberg's ruling in the Alien Enemies Act case. Well, what happens with that ruling? The Supreme Court does away with it as part of the appellate process. And so that statement kind of took on a slightly different flavor to me after that Supreme Court ruling. And so a part of me looks at these statements about, oh, it's so important for the Supreme Court to be independent because they have to check the power of the president, as almost like a lady doth protest too much, desperately trying to get good press and good coverage because the media loves to overemphasize the cases in which the Republican appointees diverge from one another or vote against the Trump administration. And, there's a possibility the court turns away the Trump administration's request to partially implement this birthright citizenship executive order. And if and when that happens, the coverage is going to be nonstop. Supreme Court, so independent. Supreme Court checks the excesses of the president. Still the same court that said the president is above the law and has absolute immunity from criming. But, so that's kind of how I see it right now.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a Supreme Court led by Roberts, who wrote the immunity decision, who wrote the Colorado insurrectionist decision, who, as I've said, and you'll tell me whether this is hyperbole or not, they completely destroyed the delicate balance between the three co-equal branches of government, elevating the presidency above the other two. By the way, at least in the hands of Donald Trump, that was the lesson he learned from the immunity decision, which is I can do anything. And we see it in action. I'm going to take over. I'm going to go after literally a full frontal assault, a hostile takeover of Congress by way of its library is going on as we're speaking, along with the, just treating Congress as the doormat that it is in the hands of MAGA. And he'll do anything, executive or legislative or judiciary, that he can get away with because he doesn't have to worry about going to jail for it.
Yeah. And so in addition to the immunity decision and the disqualification decision out of Colorado that you mentioned, which I absolutely agree kind of paved the way for this world where the president sees himself above the law, sees himself above the 14th Amendment, add in this unitary executive theory nonsense, which John Roberts has been pushing, as I write about in the book, ever since he was a lawyer in the Reagan administration. That theory maintains the president is so all powerful, he must be able to control everybody in the executive branch, and everyone in the executive branch has to be executing his will. And it's based on that idea that they have been trying to fire people in violation of federal laws. And I think that that sentiment, is also kind of behind these aggressive assertions of power vis-a-vis Library of Congress, vis-a-vis spending power and presidential impoundment. So yeah, I think the Supreme Court has definitely had its hand and a role in creating the social context and political narrative of this president has to be able to do all of these things and is entitled to do so. So yes, I think we cannot be too easy on them if and when they inevitably kind of tinker on the margins and rule against Donald Trump in a case or two here or there.
Yeah. That unitary executive idea is the concept and the advancement of unitary executive theory doctrine in the Supreme Court's case law is such
doctrine.
It's such a good example of the creation of one of these pretextual doctrines to advance the projects of the Federalist Society and the anti-regulatory interests behind it, the strong executive power desires of those interests to empower somebody like Donald Trump to do what he wants with the people not having a say. And this is an idea that the Justice Department under Reagan, where John Roberts was a young lawyer, where Sam Alito was a young lawyer, tried unsuccessfully to advance this idea in the case law. What was it? Boucher v. Sinar, where
was it Sandra Day O'Connor?
Yeah, Sandra Day O'Connor. So this is a novel theory. Where do you find this in? And here, but at this point, right, decades past that, through this incremental advancement of this idea in the constitutional law, we can put up the scare quotes, but on some level, it is doctrine. And so it gets back, I think, to what I think is a really important question, Leah, and the sort of my intro around the rule of law and what it means and how are we supposed to navigate these questions, particularly with so many Americans looking to the court to stand up against Trump as one of the few remaining institutional guardrails against autocracy. What does it mean if we accede to the idea that the court decides what the law means, and how should we navigate that going forward?
Yeah, so I guess we shouldn't accede that. What we should be doing is demanding that the court enforce the law as we can all see it. So in this birthright citizenship case, for example, in the event they ultimately declare the executive order unconstitutional or unlawful or in violation of federal law, I don't think we should be saying, well, that's because we turned over this question to John Roberts and the other Republican appointees, and they did their lawyer magic and they looked at the Constitution and all of its history and concluded based on their legalistic technocracy, that this is the right answer. No, it's because we all read it and we were all shouting from the rooftops and we were all telling them, just read the words in the dang US code, right? In the 14th Amendment, it's not that hard, guys. Do your jobs. And so I think we should recognize our own role in demanding and getting the court to enforce the law rather than thinking about it in a system where we are just turning over the questions to them.
How does let's take that further. How does our audience, who's always looking for some guidance about how to resist and how to act and put it into action, what does that mean when we say, right, pressure them, make them read the words the way they were written? What does that mean for our audience?
I think it can mean so many different things to different people. For extroverts, it might mean going out to a protest, and making signs about the 14th Amendment and birthright citizenship. It might mean, talking to different people who are part of your community about what is happening in the birthright citizenship case and your expectations and demands on the Supreme Court. It might be calling, right, representatives or local leaders or, different organizing groups and alerting them to this case is going on, right? I think we need to be communicating, to individuals in our community or our organization about what is happening. It might be writing op-eds. It might be posting. It can be so many different things to different people, basically anything that either has the potential to move the needle of public opinion and change people's understandings of the Supreme Court, or, that makes a public-facing statement about the Supreme Court and what you expect it to do. I think different people will be comfortable with different things, probably better suited to doing different things. But so many different ways.
Let me ask a question on a follow-up to that. I know people that know Roberts, and they told me that he was so wounded with the criticism after the immunity decision.
Can I just interject?
Yes.
Right? Making it all about him, main character
so
energy.
wounded.
The problem isn't, right, that he put the president above the law. The problem is people criticized him for it.
So he was. So do they respond? Can you move the needle with them? Do they respond to public outcry and sentiment being expressed against them? Or do they do like Alito says, it doesn't matter what happens in the real world when we make a decision?
Well, I think the contrast you just drew is going to be part of my answer, which is at most it works on John Roberts because he cares about superficial appearances of nonpartisanship and legitimacy. And so if he thinks the American public is going to be wholly against the court on all of the issues, all of the cases, big picture cases, ideologically salient, high profile cases they are ruling on, then he's going to want to do something else in at least some of those cases. The other guys, not so much, because going back to Alex's question about the Federalist Society, they've created this alternative universe and media ecosystem that will give those guys pats on the back and validation and affirmation for doing all of these crazy things. So even if most of the country is shouting at them, they will still receive like, great job, guys, you're doing amazing from this fringe universe that has been created to provide them, an easier path to doing that.
How do you fit Amy Coney Barrett into your thesis, into your book?
Yeah. So, part of the challenge of writing a book is, especially a book about a developing topic, is at some point you need to finalize the manuscript and print the book. And so this manuscript was finalized in January. And so there were inevitably going to be things I wish I would have been able to cover and said more explicit things about. Much has been made about our savior, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, this liberal squish, moderate institutionalist who is going to save us from Donald Trump. Let me tell you, not the facts. I think she is way smarter than the other Trump appointees. So part of this is just like a comparison to Tweedledee and Tweedledum that is giving her great coverage. Some of it is a reflection of the extreme asks of the Trump administration. As I said earlier, she voted to say the president doesn't get to exercise the legislative power to spend, and all of a sudden she's a moderate. No, she's still voting with her Republican colleagues on some of these Trump cases, like the case involving the Department of Education's grants for teacher training and others. So, I just feel like, spare me. There's inevitably some issues where the Republican appointees will differ from one another.
Mm-hmm.
The issues are different for her than they are for Justice Gorsuch, as they are for Brett Kavanaugh. But still, like, stepping back in most cases on these big ticket issues, religion, LGBT equality, voting rights, affirmative action, she is with the Republican appointees lockstep. So, yeah.
And on almost all of these issues, the agendas are completely aligned with Project 2025 and the Trump administration. And this ties back to, the conversation you two are having about these public comments from the justices about the impropriety of the impeachment threats, which to my mind are, almost like a public signal to Trump land, to people like Vance and Stephen Miller and Donald Trump that, hey guys, like, just chill. We got this. Let's advance steadily.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. Like, if you think about some of what the Trump administration is doing, obviously people have pointed out how it comes from the Project 2025 playbook, like trying to dismantle the Department of Education and whatnot. But if you look at some of what the Supreme Court is doing, like, that too comes from Project 2025, like increasing the role of religion in schools, cutting back on LGBTQ civil rights and LGBTQ inclusive reading materials. There's just a host of issues, that the court is pushing along toward, the goals of Project 2025 and Trumpism.
Yeah. This is great for the audience because they've always asked that we used to joke when we founded LegalAF that it was almost like a LegalAF law school, and people got a taste, right, from what it would, Professor Popok or Professor Mysalis or Aronson. And I think they really are getting a taste of what it would be like. It would be delightful to be in your classroom hearing you talk about these things. Although I'm sure you're a little different in your classroom?
Class is a little bit different than the podcast or the book. I teach at a public university. I believe in the value of public education, unlike the Republican appointees on the Supreme Court. I believe it should be open to everyone. I think public education has been like one of the greatest engines of social mobility in this country, which is why it's so appalling that they are attacking it. But yeah, my classroom is not exactly like the podcast or the book, which is part of why writing the book was so fun and so delightful, because I got to share all of my thoughts. I mean, believe it or not, when I teach Dobbs, the case overruling Roe, I do not liken it to a Kensurrection, which is how I describe it in my book. So, the book is much more snarky and irreverent.
Yeah, well, that's why we like you. That's why we have you here. If you could, as the writer of the book, as the prime mover there, what is it that you want, if you have done your job? What is it that you want the audience to take away from reading the book cover to cover? Like what would thrill you if the audience took away? What message is it?
Yeah. One is to feel validated and affirmed and not crazy for thinking things are really fucked up at the Supreme Court. That's part of what I wanted the book to do, like create a sense of community and like, no, you're not going crazy. Like it's them, not you, to like empower people to continue to express concern about the Supreme Court, to call their politicians about the Supreme Court and to make their voices heard about the Supreme Court. So that would be kind of like the big umbrella. Short of that, I want progressives and the left to vote more with the courts in mind. I want them to demand things of their elected leaders on the courts that we haven't thus far, appointing younger, more progressive, more professionally diverse nominees, actually appointing people who will use the law to democratize our institutions, and things like that. So a host of kind of any number of specific things, but generally under the umbrella of making you feel validated and empowered to criticize the Supreme Court and demand changes of the Supreme Court and the federal courts.
Yeah, that's terrific. I mean, for me, and then I'll yield to Alex. These conversations that I had, I know it's very hard. Alex and I have had these conversations before. The concepts like disenfranchisement. I don't care whether you like Hillary Clinton, you want to have a beer with her. If you don't vote for her, we're going to lose the United States Supreme Court for decades, and you're not going to like the result. That doesn't fit neatly on a bumper sticker. And for some reason, and we as educators in our own fields, in our own ways, we've got to do a better job of explaining what would happen. We're like, I don't like Hillary. I would tell them, hold your nose and vote for her, because I assure you, you're not going to like the Supreme Court rulings that come out after they get control of the court. And of course, that's what happened.
Well, so you're not voting for your friends? Like politicians are not going to be your friends? I don't think I really want to hang out with any elected leaders that I can think of offhand.
Barack Obama, I'd
maybe. He seems a little too earnest for me sometimes.
We need deep cynicism, but with like still that hope mixed in there somehow.
With some pop.
But Leah, I think the book accomplishes it so well, as has your entire approach to translating your deeply expert kind of scholarly understanding of constitutional law, constitutional politics, these constitutional developments through these other platforms to reach the people. And as I think about this stuff as an organizer, as a lawyer, as somebody who's trying to build this type of engagement around the importance of judicial politics and the importance of engaging with the Constitution as people active in our democracy, there's nothing more important. And it also, if you compare it again to the Federalist Society's apparatus and the way they've developed their power through the courts, a lot of it was about, with some exceptions, like the engagement of the anti-abortion base electorally on the court, a lot of it was about keeping people out through these hard to access ideas and doctrines. We have the opposite task. We need to, because we believe in democracy, we need people to sit down and engage with this stuff and find ways like you have been able to so really beautifully develop in yourself and in your communications and language, access this stuff and activate ourselves as we engage in our civic democracy day to day, not just every 2 years.
Yeah, no, the idea of kind of like peeling back the layers and democratizing law is very much, a part of the book. They can slap doctrine onto anything they want, like the major questions doctrine, which at bottom they said was about the fact that student debt relief triggered them, right? It raised questions that were personal and emotionally charged. I mean, I went through all of the opinions, right, and pulled out the language. I have the receipts, and this is the stuff they are basing the law on. And I just think people should know that.
I loved your title too, because I thought it was, I'm not sure this went into the mix, but I instantly thought of Gorsuch's book of Overruled.
Oh, yeah.
I was like, he's there with Overruled, and your response is Lawless.
Yeah.
Right?
That book was so Neil Gorsuch, like the wild mischaracterizations of basic facts, so on brand. And to put that into, again, a book that you are sending out to the entire American public. I mean, I guess it's no different than putting it in the US reports. So like whatever, or screaming it at oral argument. But my guy, right? Like they're fact checkers for a reason.
As we end the interview tomorrow, or this week is going to be the as we said at the top, the first oral argument related to a Trump policy. People are like, what are you talking about, Popok? I said, yeah, there's 13 emergency applications, but this is the first oral argument about something in Trump world. And the way it's framed, I'm not sure we're getting to birthright citizenship, but we are getting to nationwide injunction power of a federal judge. Knowing what you know, and you know the players, including people like Gorsuch, that has written extensively about his arch nemesis, nationwide injunctions. Yeah. But they have approved them in a number of different places over the years. What do you think is going to happen? We won't hold you to it, but what do you think?
Yeah. Honestly, I am totally up in the air. On one hand, I just think this is such a freebie for them to rule against the Trump administration. And if any case called for nationwide injunctions, it would be an immigration case involving birthright citizenship. Right. So it's just wild. And they have turned away, requests to narrow nationwide injunctions repeatedly over the last few years. So that's on one hand. On the other, I'm very scared that they granted this case, put it on the regular docket, because in all of the shadow docket cases that they've moved over for argument, they've always ruled for the party seeking relief. So that is not a great sign. Also, never underestimate the ability of Brett Kavanaugh to hold super stupid thoughts in his head. Like, he thinks you can vacate a rule under the Administrative Procedure Act, and that's fine. But maybe you can't order a nationwide injunction against the president, and saying no nationwide injunctions against the president is somehow going to fix their emergency docket / shadow docket. Like, all of these things would just be very strange to hold in your head, and yet can't rule it out.
Yet here we are.
Yeah. So I really don't know.
Right. And John Sauer is going to be arguing for the. I know. He's very difficult to listen to. I mean,
worst downgrade ever from
I know.
Solicitor General Prelogar. I mean,
I know. Yeah, and so wacky. And I don't think that plays well over time. I could take him in small doses, like the 2 immunity and insurrectionist ballot thing. But over time, he is so out there that I think he loses. I could be wrong. Amy Coney Barrett and some of the other, maybe Roberts on occasion. But I agree with you. Roberts, if he thinks it's slipping away from him, he does have this habit of, siding with Obamacare and right, and sliding up. But of course, he didn't do it with Dobbs, when the leak led everybody to stop talking to each other and stop soliciting votes behind the scenes. I mean, the shadow docket thing has been an evil genius for Donald Trump. Of course, they're allowing him to do that by using the shadow docket. They're pressuring an institution that's not ready to act this way. We get these half-paragraph decisions that we have to daven over about what they don't even know what they mean half the time, with no incomplete record, no oral argument, no time for the justices to talk to each other or to circulate opinions or to deliberate, which is exactly what Donald Trump wants, right? He wants the reflexive, ideological, you four over there, you three over there, and we'll fight for one out of the two in the middle or whatever it is.
Also, they allow the court to let the Trump administration to implement their policies without the court having to really own it. Like, take the ban on transgender service members, for example. That policy is grotesque. It basically labels the entire transgender community as lacking in honesty, humility, total character assassination. The lower court judge said it reeked of animus. Supreme Court doesn't have to acknowledge any of that in an opinion. They just say, stay granted.
Yeah. Even there, though, just talk about lip service. I would have thought that would have been a perfect opportunity for Sotomayor or Kagan or Ketanji Brown Jackson to write a dissent of some sort, a statement of some sort. Nope. Just they wouldn't have granted the stay. Really? Yeah. That's where we're at now.
I wish I could have included that case in my book, because the pointed contrast between them saying, oh yeah, that policy is fine. This policy that, again, grossly defames and libels and just shits all over the transgender community, with a statement that Justice Scalia made in his dissent in Windsor when he said, striking down the Defense of Marriage Act adjudged religious and social conservatives enemies of the human race. Like, the idea, again, that striking down DOMA is rank discrimination over animus against people who don't believe in marriage equality, but the ban on transgender service members is fine, is just a perfect encapsulation of this conservative grievance mindset.
Professor Leah Litman, author of the new book, Lawless, co-host of the Strict Scrutiny podcast. Leah, thank you so much for joining us here on LegalAF. Audience, please don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel for more great content, interviews with amazing experts and scholars like Leah, and the brilliance and energy of my friend Michael Popok. Until next time, please stay mad, stay motivated, and stay mighty. Signing off.
Can't get your fill of LegalAF? Me neither. That's why we formed the LegalAF Substack. Every time we mention something in a hot take, whether it's a court filing or a oral argument, come over to the Substack. You'll find the court filing and the oral argument there, including a daily roundup that I do called, wait for it, Morning AF. What else? All the other contributors from LegalAF are there as well. We got some new reporting. We got interviews. We got ad-free versions of the podcast and hot takes. Where? LegalAF on Substack. Come over now to free subscribe.